I met Ben Omar by chance. It was at the end of April 1941, and as subsequent events showed, that chance saved my life. At that time, I was serving as a messenger in Rommel's army. One day I was driving in my armoured vehicle along the Via Balbia road, and not far from Acroma Fort, west of Tobruk. I saw an Italian army truck standing on the side of the road. Behind it, I noticed 4 men kicking some object with their feet. I slowed down, partly out of curiosity, but mostly because I was tired of driving alone. I decided to have a word with the representatives of our valiant allies, who were the only people I met on this stretch of the road, since I spoke a little Italian. As I approached, I saw that the Italians, a sergeant and 3 privates, were beating a completely naked Arab with the flat sides of their bayonets. The unfortunate man was handcuffed to the rear wheel of the lorry, and the Italians were beating him mercilessly in the stifling heat of midday. After hitting the captive several times, they were tapping on a bottle of red wine. All of them were heavily intoxicated. Each of them held a half-empty bottle in one hand and a bayonet in the other. The immobile, naked body of the Arab, bleeding, lay face down on the sand. "Viva Tedesco! Me long of the Germans," shouted the sergeant as I jumped down to the ground. Come stay. How are you?" asked one of the soldiers. "Molto bene," I replied. I was indeed doing well. "Will you have a drink?" the sergeant asked and handed me a bottle. I took it gladly. No one could refuse a drink in this scalding heat. Staring curiously at the body stretched out on the sand, I asked who it was. "A pile of shit," the sergeant replied, hitting the man in the side with a heavy boot. He didn't even move. Apparently he was already dead. He was stealing guns and shells. "We caught him yesterday at sunset. He was driving a bomb-damaged lorry past Acroma," grumbled the sergeant and kicked the prisoner again, who this time folded in half. When the Italians saw this, they laughed. I almost threw up when I saw their laughing faces. "What are you going to do with him?" I asked, taking another sip from the bottle and handing it to the sergeant. "Nothing much," he answered carelessly. "They told us to take him to the prison camp in Derna, but I doubt he'll get there. Why waste petrol and drag that vile Arab 200 miles when we can have some fun with him, and then report that he was killed trying to escape?" And he took a sip of wine. I tried to hide the resentment that swept over me, thanked them for the wine and told them I was in a hurry and had to go. I climbed into my armoured car. "Arrive Dursic, goodbye," the Italians shouted in chorus. As I slipped into the gun turret of my armoured car, where there was a twin cannon and machine gun, I saw that the angle of elevation was too great for firing. So I started the engine, and after driving about 50 yards away, stopped the armoured car and climbed back into the turret to the machine gun. The 4 Italians watched my movements with astonishment, but when I turned the turret and pointed the machine gun at them, they had no doubt of my intentions. "Don't move," I shouted. The faces of the Italian soldiers were petrified with horror. "Yes, untie this man and let one of you bring him here," I shouted. None of them moved. The fountains of sand that rose at their feet told them that I had no intention of joking. Then the sergeant took a key out of his pocket and unlocked the handcuffs. "Put him on his feet," I said, "and bring him here." The Arab was stunned. He staggered and stumbled as the sergeant led him to my car. I kept the rest of the soldiers in the crosshairs of the machine gun, and the sergeant helped the Arab walk until he grabbed the edge of the turret with his hands and threw his body with a groan into my armoured vehicle. Without a word, I jumped into the driver's seat, leaving the mutilators to stare at me in surprise. 2 days later, the Arab could take care of himself, and we parted in El Tazal, where the headquarters of the Italian High Command was at that time. There he joined a small camel caravan travelling further into Cyrenaica on the road through Barcae. The Arab said his name was Ben Omar. I didn't know Arabic and he didn't know German, but we were able to explain ourselves in Italian. "If you ever find yourself in Barca," he said to me, "I would love to have you. I will give you anything you wish, for you saved my life." Forget it, I laughed. Things happen in war. I didn't think I would ever see Ben Omar again. There were so many things going on that I didn't think about this little road accident and soon forgot all about it. It was a hot June day in 1941. My foot slipped off the accelerator pedal and the armoured car stopped abruptly. I switched off the ignition and the roar of the engine immediately subsided, freezing my sweat-wet hands. I removed the goggles that protected my eyes from dust and the cloth I had tied around my mouth and nose to keep the sand out. Then I opened the heavy steel hatch and climbed out of my seat, an avalanche of sand falling on my back. Grabbing my binoculars, I hid in the turret of my armored vehicle and began to survey the desert. But the glare of the sun almost blinded me, and it was impossible to touch the machine gun. I lowered the binoculars. There was nothing to see but sand and rocks and the endless Tariq el Abd, the caravan route from Tami to El Adam and on to Bardia, past covering my eyes with my palm. I strolled along the path and noticed a pile of empty fuel drums. "So I'm 3/4 of the way there," I murmured, and glanced up at the sky to see the sun was setting. By nightfall, I would reach the headquarters of the armoured division under which I was serving. I had travelled somewhere around 90 kilometres, with 30 more to go. This part of the desert and the caravan route itself were not to my liking. They were filled with all sorts of surprises, most of them deadly. Here one could attract the attention of a British Hurricane fighter pilot, flying at a low angle and looking for a target, run over an anti-tank mine, or stumble upon one of the British reconnaissance patrols, who often drove armoured cars or jeeps, 1, 2, or 3, along the caravan routes and were not afraid of anything. Remembering this, I put my binoculars to my eyes again and scrutinized the area. But I saw nothing but dunes, over which waves of hot air rippled. After making sure that there was no one around, I jumped down from the armoured vehicle, lifted the steel bonnet and started to take care of the engine. I cleaned the air filter, checked the oil, added water to the radiator. Back in the car, I wiped the dust off the breech of the machine gun, and when I pulled the trigger, it hissed like an angry kitten. The 20mm gun went off with a deafening crackle, assuring me that it was in working order. Glancing at the huge water canister, I allowed myself a couple of sips of the lukewarm water, feeling my strength restored. I closed the turret hatch and returned to the driver's seat. I twiddled the radio control knobs, but found that it wasn't working and needed to be inspected by a qualified technician. Time to go. The engine sneezed and roared and I moved on. I could not wait to get back to headquarters. Maybe there was a letter from home waiting for me. It would also be good to know how my messenger squad was doing, for I had spent a fortnight in the repair shops west of El Ghazala and had not seen my comrades for a long time. Thinking of the rest and news from home that awaited me, I drove faster and faster, anxious to get through the last 25 kilometres of the bumpy, sandy road. Suddenly, the steel hull of my armoured vehicle was rattled with bullets, clearly from a machine gun. To the right and left in front of me, fountains of sand flew up, blocking my view. Then another hail of bullets pounded the armour. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the British armoured cars behind me. I pushed harder on the accelerator and my 9-ton box on wheels surged forward. With my left hand, I shifted speed, and in the cacophony of drumming bullets, roaring engine and howling gears, I heard the rattle of armour plates covering the wheels. A hail of bullets scattered across the armour again. In the mirror, I could see that I was being chased by 2 British armoured cars. They were very close and coming at full speed. I could not keep them in my sight all the time, for my car was being tossed and thrown from side to side like a cradle being rocked frantically. I had no onboard gunner, and I could only fire when I stopped the car. The thought made me uneasy. Hot sweat, blinding me for a moment, flooded my eyes, and I almost lost my way, barely visible through the narrow slits. Suddenly I remembered that my armoured car was better adapted than the British ones for driving over the rough terrain that lay on either side of the road. I turned the wheel sharply, the car skidded violently on the soft sand, and I sped off into the desert. Bullets were now pounding on the side I had given to the enemy, and glancing in the mirror I saw that the 2 British cars, too, had turned off the road without slackening their speed. Fear seized me. I realized that they had decided to pursue me among the rocks and sand pits. The pounding of bullets died down. I drove like a madman, skirting boulders, skidding through hollows, sliding down hillsides strewn with gravel, and squeezing the last of my strength out of the car. I took one hand off the steering wheel for a moment and tore the covers off my machine gun and cannon. But then the car went into a hole and, jumping out of it, crashed at full speed into a large rock. I hit my head on the front panel and sparks flew from my eyes. But fear overcame the pain and told me what to do. The seat belt was unbuckled, the gear lever was in neutral, The turret hatch was open. All of this happened instantly, as if by magic. The turret and cannon creaked and turned towards my pursuers. The sight could drive some people crazy. The British armoured cars were looping among the boulders at a distance of about 300 metres and were aiming straight at me. I lowered the barrel of my gun, trying to take one of them in my sights. Bullets rumbled past my turret, hitting and ricocheting off the sand and rocks. At such a high speed and manoeuvring between the rocks, the British, of course, could not aim accurately, and their bullets mostly flew past. I pressed the button and fired 4 shells. A wall of sand and dust grew next to the first armoured car, forcing it to roll over and give me its side. I'd be an idiot if I didn't take that opportunity. The second armoured vehicle popped up from behind the rocks and fired a fan of machine gun fire, filling the air with a devilish laughter, fountains of sand and rocks that blocked my view for a moment. The first armoured vehicle swerved again, giving me the other side. This was a chance. Catching it in my crosshairs, I fired. The cannon jerked like a wild animal, and several 20mm shells struck the ground in front of the English armoured car, and 2 or 3 burst in the upper part of the iron monster. Another shell flew past with a wild howl, and another blew a huge hole above the wheel, whence black smoke burst forth. From the impact, the English armoured car almost toppled over. Swerving sharply, it disappeared behind the rocks. The second armoured car was running at full speed towards the same shelter. It was almost impossible to hit it, except by a miracle. It made unimaginable zigzags and soon disappeared behind the rocks after the first. My pursuers were out of sight, and I was a little relieved that their machine guns would not get me now, and there were no automatic guns on the British armoured cars. I quickly reloaded my gun and pointed the twin barrels of the machine gun and cannon at the rocks, waiting for the enemy to appear. Suddenly a column of flame and smoke erupted from behind the rocks, after which I heard the frantic crackle of tearing bullets. Traces of tracer bullets scattered across the sky. I screamed with joy like a madman. The car I had hit exploded. I zastravat from the machine gun on the tops of rocks, but quickly realized that only wasted ammunition. Thick, black smoke covered everything. Through the crackle of bursting bullets, I heard the engine of a car start. The second armoured car might well have attacked me again, so I watched the edge of the stone cluster very carefully, waiting for it to appear, but soon realized that it was moving away, hiding behind the rocks where the shells of my gun could not reach it. A few minutes later, I saw a column of dust rising into the sky 2 kilometers away. The surviving vehicle was returning to the British troop position. I relaxed and thought that I had saved myself by a miracle. If the British had guns instead of their armoured car would now be burning mine. I wondered if the surviving armoured car had taken the crew of the burning one with it. If not, the enemy could be waiting for me behind the rocks with a machine gun and hand grenades. Out of caution, I again gave a line from the cannon. The shells fell behind and between the rocks. After that, I reloaded the gun and scrutinized the rocks with binoculars. There seemed to be no one behind them. There was still thick smoke and dust. Flames were shooting up, and the air was punctuated by tracer bullets. On the horizon, the dust kicked up by a distant British armoured car was billowing. At full speed, it was hurtling towards the Egyptian border, which Mussolini had once encircled with barbed wire towards Fort Maddalena. After scrutinizing the desert around me through binoculars and seeing nothing suspicious, I jumped down to the ground to inspect my car while keeping an eye on the rocks. What I saw sent shivers down my spine. The right front wheel of my armoured vehicle was skewed. Looking under the car, I realized what was wrong. The transverse steering link had broken, which meant I wasn't going anywhere. The car's armour had been mangled by bullets, and the heads of several rivets in the hull had been knocked off. The glass and mirror of one of the headlights was shattered. Not hoping to move the armoured vehicle, I climbed into it, took my automatic rifle and a couple of magazines off the hook, slid to the ground and surveyed the rocks. Looking out from behind the rocks, I saw that the bullets had stopped bursting, but the British armoured car was still burning inside. Tongues of flame were shooting out from there. No one was in sight. The crew left in the rescued armoured car. I saw that my shell had hit the petrol tank. There was so much heat coming from the hull that I could not approach the burning English armoured car and look inside. 5 minutes later, after much fiddling with the radio station, I finally got a connection and reported to headquarters about the situation I was in. I asked for a tow truck or a new steering rod. When they found out where I was, They assured me that help would come very quickly. Headquarters also promised to send a fighter plane to prevent the British from sending new armoured trucks, or a plane to finish me off until the promised help arrived. 10 minutes later, a Messerschmitt fighter flew over me, surveying the desert for miles around. Then an armoured car arrived, and soon the breakdown was repaired. We approached the burnt-out British armoured car. The fire had already gone out, and we peered through the open hatch. On the steel floor, among the ashes and empty shell casings, lay a mangled, black, charred body. The picture was horrible, but that was the fate of armoured car crews. There was no way to get the dead man out, although the fire had already gone out. The hull of the armoured car I hit was still red-hot, so we drove off, leaving the body of the dead Englishman in the steel box of the burnt-out car. To be honest, I wasn't too upset. In his place, burnt beyond recognition, it could well have been me. An hour after dark, we arrived at the headquarters of the Tank Division, the 5th Light Division. From August 1941, it was called the 21st Tank Division. The sentries quickly lit and immediately switched off the red lights, and, having exchanged passwords, we drove through the outer ring of the cordon. A kilometre later, we passed another cordon, and, having repeated the whole inspection procedure, we got to the Holy of Holies, the location of the division command. The armoured vehicle ahead of us stopped, and the man sitting in the turret turned to me. "Do you know, Tunter, where your messenger group is?" he asked. "No, I haven't been here yet." "You guys have changed locations since I left," I replied. "You'd better get on my cart and show me the way." He climbed out of the gun turret and jumped on the hull of my car. "Then, turn to the right and drive slowly, or you'll hit the tents." I could see only the dim outlines of the tents. The lights were only allowed to be lit inside and not to be shining outside under any circumstances. I wandered through this cluster of army dwellings and soon stopped at the entrance to one of them. "Here is your tent," said my guide. "There seems to be someone there." Through a hole in the canvas there was a small point of light. "I hope I am no longer needed." "No, you're not." "Thanks for walking me out," I said, swinging my legs off the gun turret. "See you tomorrow. Good night." I shouted and jumped to the ground. The flap that closed the entrance to the tent opened, and for a moment the light of the lantern was visible. Someone looked outside. "Is it you, Gunter?" "No, it's my ghost," I answered. But then 2 hands, sticking out of the darkness, grabbed me by the shoulders and dragged me into the tent. "Yes, a real ghost, you rascal. You picked up a bunch of English armoured cars somewhere, drove them off, and then asked for help. I was worried sick about you." I spun round and threw my hands off my shoulders. "You were worried," I laughed. "Tell that to Rommel. Maybe he'll promote you." I was glad to be home. "How are you doing here, Joseph?" I looked at him and saw the smile fade on his face. He was a gruff man who had fought a lot, been promoted and demoted many times. Private Joseph Hinz. He was an Austrian who had served in the army for 4 years, but had remained a private. The ranks did not stick to him. No sooner had he been promoted to non-commissioned officer than he was immediately involved in some story and became a private again. I looked at him in surprise. "Why are you sour?" I asked, unbuckling my gun belt and tossing it into the corner of the tent. "You look like you're out of cigarettes or women." With that, I sat down on the crate. Joseph's eyes looked at me seriously. He sat down on the other crate opposite. "No, it's not about women." He chewed on those words, pulling a packet of cigarettes out of his pocket. "It's not them at all. We'll soon be out of messengers." And he looked at me gloomily. I was surprised, and I felt uneasy. "Why?" "Because there's a lull at the front. Sit back and enjoy the rest." "Enjoy the rest, you say? Our unit has nothing else to do but rest. And all our messengers have enjoyed the lull so much that I'm all alone in this canvas tent. Until you came back, I had no one to talk to. Thank God the British didn't manage to gut you." His face was burning. "What are you talking about?" I said slowly, frozen in place. "Yes, that there are only 2 men left of our whole unit." "Me and you," Joseph said quietly. I didn't immediately realize the meaning of what he had said, but after a quick glance around the tent, I saw only my things and Joseph's. "Who moved them to another place?" I asked in a harsh tone. "Was it Lieutenant Crone?" There was no reply. Joseph stared at me in silence. I jumped up and grabbed him by the collar of his shirt. "Tell me who and where," I shouted. They're all dead. Nerd, I repeated confusedly. He nodded. Yes, all 6 of them, and the 7th is probably still wandering somewhere in the desert. It's the 5th day now, or maybe he's dead too. I looked at him, not believing my ears. He flicked a match and lit a cigarette. I'll break your head if you mess with me, I promised. Joseph looked at me calm. I'm not joking. I'm telling you everyone is dead. He said these words without any expression. Hans, Klaus, Fritz, Paul, Theo, Leo, and I don't know about Egon. But I think he's dead too. It's been 5 days since he left and not a word, not a sign. They sent a plane to look for him. Bir Hakim is not that far from here and Egon is gone. He finished his story. What happened to the others? I asked. Theo and Paul hit an anti-tank mine. Now they are in heaven with the car. Where did it happen? I asked. At Fort Acroma. And I just drove past Acroma this morning. Hey, Leo and Fritz were torn apart by a shell fired by an English gun from besieged Tobruk. We only found 2 buttons. Hans got hit by a macaroni bullet when he went to the Italian camp to fetch water. Joseph exhaled a cloud of cigarette smoke. I could hardly believe my ears. Do you want to know what happened to Klaus? Joseph asked quietly. I nodded. He was shot this morning. At those words I thought I saw a firing squad in front of me. No. Shot. I exclaimed. Hush you, Joseph hissed and put his hand over my mouth. I slapped his arm and grabbed his shoulder. Are you saying he's been executed? Joseph nodded again. He shot non-commissioned Officer Helmut. He had a big fight. I was at a loss for words. But who was this Helmut? I asked. Yes, this is the former SS man who was sent here a month ago from Berlin. You know him, Gunther. I nodded. But how did it happen? What was the reason? I don't know, but Klaus had a big fight with him on the beach. Someone even said that Klaus called him retired crematorium chief, and the sergeant pulled a gun. But Klaus was more nimble and put 5 bullets in him. It all seemed like a bad dream. Joseph told terrible things. When did it happen? I asked, sinking down on the crate. Yesterday morning. The sentries handcuffed him. The tribunal met in the afternoon, and at dawn today Klaus was executed, he finished. Did you see him before he died? I asked hoarsely. No, he didn't want to see anyone. I asked to be allowed to talk to him. But you know, I'm glad he refused. I'd have had to shoot the sentries to let him get away. No, I'm glad he didn't want to see anyone, Joseph said thoughtfully and stood up. He didn't want me to see his face, and I didn't want him to see mine. How did the others feel about it, Joseph? Gritted his teeth. It's a good thing the former SS man died from Klaus's bullets, or some of the boys would have used up all their ammunition on him. My friend answered and pulled out a spirit light. Let me make you a plate of stew, he said, and took a tin knife out of the bag. Thank you, Joseph. I'm not hungry, I mumbled. Listen, don't get discouraged. I felt bad myself, but you have to pull yourself together. You can't bring Klaus back, and you have to let it go. I listened and nodded. Yes, of course. I understood the deaths of the 2 guys who had been hit by a British shell from Tobruk and the ones who had hit a mine. It was bad enough that Egon got lost in the desert, but it could have happened to anyone. But Klaus. I fell silent and thought. Would you like some coffee? Joseph asked. Coffee? Do you have real coffee? Of course, and a lot of it. Enough for the rest of the war. He smiled and lifted the cot with his foot. Underneath it were 2 large sacks. Coffee. How many lire did you pay for it, damn you? I asked, hardly believing my eyes. What lire? Joseph exploded. Are you crazy? Just a dozen machine gun belts and 2 boxes of hand grenades. We took that coffee from the bastards who shot Tans when he tried to take their water canister. 1 single canister from a stack 6 meters high and the length of a Berlin apartment block. And these vile Italian fools, who had never even smelt war, put a bullet in Tanser for a single jerry can of water. Joseph continued to tell the story, helping himself with gestures. We went there in a captured British armoured car on the same night that Taine was killed. And do you know what happened? He asked, putting a kettle of water on the small cooker and looking at me. No, I don't know, I answered, pulling my boots off my feet. But I knew what he was talking about, for I knew Joseph well. At full speed, with the British flag flying, we burst into the camp of these macaroni and tore it to hell. We crushed the tents and all their stuff with our wheels, pouring machine gun fire and grenades. Then he laughed wildly. First thing we did was tear down the radio transmitter shack so they couldn't call for help. Can you imagine? They recorded the cry of help on a tape recorder. I guess they were afraid they'd forget which word to shout. I was amazed at the madness. Joseph waved his hand and went on with his story. There were cries of Inglesi, Inglesi, mercy, mercy, or something like that. We were running round the camp like lightning. We drove the car into the kitchen and teens jumped down and started grabbing tins of tinned food. The Italians had stacks of them and a lot of bags of coffee. Then we threw an English flag on a 200-litre barrel, and when we left we put anti-tank grenades everywhere and pierced a lot of water jerry cans. We gave them a real flood. We were laughing so much that we didn't notice that the boiling water started spilling out of the kettle. Joseph threw coffee into it, and a divine aroma wafted through the tent. And what happened next? I asked. We went back to the camp, put the armoured vehicle where it stood, distributed the food among us, collected empty shell casings from the floor of the vehicle, so that no one would guess that someone had fired the machine guns, and went to drink coffee. Joseph chuckled. We shook those bastards up pretty good. That's for killing Tans. Now I think they'll stop killing Germans, he said, and brought the coffee pot over to pour me a cup of coffee. It was fine, but it was too hot. Did our superiors never realize anything? Of course not. Joseph exclaimed. If they had, we'd all be court-martialed. The chiefs thought that soldiers from the Australian division had broken into the Italian camp, especially after they saw the British flag we left behind. Joseph shook with laughter again. You should have seen what happened the next morning, he said. Mother of God, a whole procession came here. What procession? I interrupted. The Macaronians, Joseph explained. There were a couple of colonels, 4 majors, a bunch of captains, not to mention the rest of the crap that followed them. They turned up to our general, old man von Ravenstein, and started complaining that our troops had let through their positions the armoured cars of the Australian division from Tobruk, which had defeated the Italian camp. And do you know what the old prick replied to them? I shook my head. He said that if they'd played their mandolins a bit less and taken up arms more often, they'd have managed to drive those bloody Australians away from their camp. After all, not one Italian colonel had the foresight to rush after the British armoured cars and smash the hell out of them, and this despite the fact that everyone knows. Here, 20 kilometres from the front line, there can be no enemy reconnaissance patrols. What a disgrace. After that, the old man ordered the sentries to clear the camp. You should have seen those Italians jump into their cars and run away. They even forgot that they had come to ask us to help them rebuild the camp. I was laughing, and I couldn't stop laughing. Are these the Italians from whom Leo and I once took water? I finally asked. They are. The rear units of the tank division Ariete, nodded Josie. It's a pity you weren't with us. You would have at least translated what they were shouting. However, we tried to get rid of them as soon as possible, because 2 kilometres away from their camp are our tanks. And if they had noticed the English tin can we came on, we would have been in trouble. I think our tankers would be glad to help you, if they were warned in advance. I remarked, and getting up from the crate, spread a blanket on the floor. Let's go to bed, Joseph. I've been running around the sands all morning and I'm very tired. So I lay down on the blanket. It's early. It's only 10 o'clock, Joseph objected. Oh, I forgot. You've got 2 letters here. They've been there for days. I sat down and he took the letters out of his things. One from home and the other, judging by the smell, must be from your girlfriend in Berlin. He smiled and held out the letters to me. Do you always sniff the correspondence? I asked, reading the addresses on the envelopes. Once I got into these sands, I became a pervert. Even the smell excites me now, and all because there are no women here. I wish they'd opened one brothel on the border. Then the Australians would have abandoned their positions in Tobruk. There were English, Indians, Poles and Czechs defending here as part of the British forces, in addition to Australians, and rushed there. He muttered to himself as I opened the letter from my mother. But as I read the letter, it fell out of my hands and landed on the blanket. My throat was suddenly dry, and a groan escaped me. I stared at the letter as if it were a blazing fire that made my brain catch fire. "What's wrong?" Joseph's voice came from far away. I couldn't see him. He grabbed my shoulder. "Hey, what's wrong with you? Are you sick?" I pushed his hand away and stood up. When I looked at the blanket, I saw the printed letter, so I hadn't dreamt it. Everything swam in front of me. Joseph, the things in the tent. Everything became one indistinguishable mass except the letter. The white paper stood out sharply against the murky background. The letter was the only thing I could see clearly, and when I stepped out of the tent into the darkness of the night, it was still in front of my eyes. The moon was shining in the black African sky like a lamp, and from it a bright silvery track stretched across the sea water. Small waves hit the shore, stretching along it like endless ribbons. The sea itself was black and motionless. Not a sound, not a whisper. Looking at all this, but seeing nothing, I sat silently on the top of the dune, while pictures of the past appeared in my brain. A beautiful house, a lovely garden where roses and other flowers bloomed in abundance, a quiet street in front of it. My home, a man in his 40s, not yet old, but beginning to grey. His face was seldom smiling, a little heavy, as if carved from stone and cut through with early wrinkles. These were the marks of the indelible impressions which life had made upon him. His figure, strong, unbending, very straight, as if he had swallowed an arshin, showed that he was an ex-officer, a high optman of the Kaiser's army. The man's poise and stature reminded him of years gone by, years of German pride, strength, and suffering. When the man moved, his gait was a reminder of what could not be forgotten. The First World War, the hardships, the attacks, the trenches, the shells and bullets. One day, as a boy, I found a small box tied to a Luger pistol parabellum. Eddy in a chest of drawers. I opened the box and brought it into the room where the man was sitting. Putting it in front of him, I asked, "Tell me, what is this?" He looked intently into my face and told me to sit down next to him. Then slowly but very emotionally he told me what he had experienced during the First World War. "It's a black iron cross, very simple. This is the Iron Cross of the second class." The man's hand placed it on the table and I listened to the story. "Another cross with a silver rim. This is an Iron Cross of the first class." And I listened to another story. Now in my father's hands was a bluish cross with gold edges and the Kaiser's crown embossed in the centre. "The Order of Merit," father explained. "It was the highest honour in the Kaiser's army. There were other medals and crosses in the box. Finally he took out a silver medal. It was the medal awarded to soldiers and officers who were wounded." I looked at my father and a smile flashed across his face. "Yes, son, I got this medal for my mangled leg too," he said, and handing me the box with the guns strapped to it, told me to put it back where I had taken it. That was what my father was like. I thought of this incident as I gazed at the sea, so calm and peaceful. Suddenly my solitude was disturbed by the sound of footsteps. I looked up and saw Joseph standing next to me. He was sent to a concentration camp and hanged there. He whispered these words, and I realized that Joseph had read my mother's letter, which had been left in the tent. For a while he sat silently by my side. "What will you do now, Gunther?" he asked. I did not answer anything, and then it seemed to dawn on me. "Go away," I said. "I'll desert the army today." Joseph looked at me, and after a little silence, "I understand you. I'd leave too. Well, let's go together." We got up and moved in the dark towards our tent. The camp was unusually quiet, looping among the tents, cars and crevices in which the soldiers hid from the bombing. We met no one. I asked Joseph where everyone had gone. There, in the big company tent, they had some kind of a general party. He explained, pointing to a distant grove of date palms. "Is there some kind of holiday today?" I asked. "Hurrah. It's the first time we've had beer in a while. I reckon we'll get a pot or so per brother. They're probably stamping their feet standing in the queue. I don't care about that," he muttered. At that moment, a brass band played in the distance and hoarse voices called out, "We're bombing England." "I'd like to know what they'll do when they run out of bombs," Joseph said snidely and pulled back the flap of our tent so we could enter. "I don't know, but I can imagine what will happen here when they find out I've disappeared." Joseph smiled. "Me too," he said. "What?" I exclaimed. Where are you going, you fool? I'm as stupid as you are. Why can't I go with you? Do you think I'd like to stay here alone in this canvas tent? He cut him off and pulled out his duffel bag from behind the cot. He dumped its contents on the ground. Let's see what we might need. We should only take the essentials. But I walked up to him and pushed his stuff into a corner with my foot. What do you think you're doing? He hissed, angry. I don't need you to risk your life for me, I said. Oh, that's it. So if you have the Iron Cross First Class and other honours, you think you can risk your life alone? There was anger in his eyes. No, I don't. But as far as I know, you have a wife, so chill out. Because even if you manage to escape from here, they'll grab her and fuck her good. Let them. He snorted. It wouldn't be the first time. She's been fucked by everyone. Ever since I went to the front, she hasn't missed a single uniformed bastard who's come on holiday. He shouted. Joseph's explosion of emotion shook me to the core. Listen, Joseph, but how the hell do you know all this since you haven't been home for ages? I asked. Do you think I'm stupid? He blurted out and threw some things into his bag. When I came back from France on holiday last year, she met me with a sucker in her arms, and I didn't realize she'd had a baby. She said she was going to surprise me. It was like he was spitting words out of his mouth. Yeah, it was a surprise. What a... And I was in Poland at the right time, fighting the bloody Poles, and I could not reward her with this Aryan brat of blue blood. He turned his face to. Listen, Gunter, you're not married. I guess you've had plenty of women, so it's hard for you to understand how I ended up with such a slut. But that's just my luck. I realized he was serious about running away with me, and that there was no changing his mind. But you realize that if we are caught, we will be shot without trial. I asked cautiously, What are you saying? I didn't know that. He laughed. But when the day comes when they want to poke holes in your skin, I'll be there for you. The fellows who do this nefarious business will lose sleep. When they see what kind of chubby-headed prick, they're going to have to shoot. They're going to die laughing. I don't think they've ever shot anyone funnier than me. 4 years in the army will make anyone a jerk. I couldn't help smiling. Joseph, it turned out, was a terrible fatalist. All right, I said. Sit down and let's think it over, and hurry up. It's nearly midnight, and we've got to leave before 2 o'clock or all is lost. Why wait till 2 o'clock? I'll take only this, he said, pointing to his bag. We'll get on the bus, drive to the border and have breakfast with the Australians if they have breakfast. I shook my head. It won't work. It's not going to work. Why not? Joseph was surprised. Well, for one thing, because there are minefields along the border guarded by our guys. And I'm not leaving, Joseph, to get blown up on a mine or to become a moving target. I've been that many times and I've had enough. Besides, I don't want to end up in a British prison camp. What if the war lasts another 10 years? I said and started pulling my things out of the bags. Where the hell are you going to run to if not to our best friends in Tobruk? Joseph looked at me in surprise. Do you really hope to make it home? He asked, as if questioning whether I was in my right mind. No, I know I can't get home, Joseph, but I have an uncle in Africa, in Portuguese Angola, in Luanda. I think he'd be glad to see me. Joseph sat down like that. Uncle. And where did you say he lives? On the west coast of Africa, south of the Congo. I think, but I'm not sure, that it's 1,003 kilometers to Luanda. Half of it will be desert, but we'll manage, I said and started putting my things in my rucksack. I know that you were a navigator, second mate or whatever you call it, but walking across the Sahara is not like splashing in the ocean, Joseph said doubtfully. You are right, but in principle it is the same. The only difference is that there is water there and here, sand, that's all. Joseph annoyed me a little, but I remembered that he had never sailed the Amazon, never harebrained on a ship, never escaped from a steamer in Tonga. He didn't have the adventurous streak I had. Listen, Joseph, I said. We'll leave here and move west of Cyrenaica and hide in the highlands. There we will set up camp and gather everything we need to cross the Sahara, and we will need a lot. And when the time is right, we'll be on our way and you'll see what happens. Mikey smiles. Just like that. Yes, simple, I replied and looked at him. Except for one thing. As soon as we get out of here, Rommel's entire African corps will be after us, and if they catch us, it won't be to kiss us. It's to make corpses out of us. And as soon as they start shooting at me, I'll shoot back, no matter whether it's a German, an Italian, or an Arab from the catacombs. I told him all this and saw that Joseph thought about it. When I leave and am outlawed, I will be as cruel and ruthless as everyone else is to me. I can't get through otherwise, and I might as well stay or play a tune on hand grenades. But I'm going, and I'm going to get through. I will do everything for it, regardless of any obstacles. Joseph's face lit up with enthusiasm, and he snapped his fingers in front of my nose. Listen, Tunter, I'm beginning to like this. You've had a lot of experience sailing the seas. I have a feeling that when we get out of here, we're in for a big adventure. We'll make it, I'm sure of it. Damn you. All right then, let's figure it out. I looked at him thoughtfully. We need guns, ammunition, water, petrol and money. What's the money for? There is nothing to buy here. Joseph interrupted me. Yeah, no. But in Cyrenaica there is something to buy, I answered. Where is the tent of the treasurer who gives us our wages? Now just round the corner, said Joseph, smiling slyly. Good, let's go there. I'm sure he's partying with everyone else. Either remembering Lily Marley or bombing England and getting drunk on beer. With that, I holstered my parabellum. Are you going to take all the cash from him? Joseph asked, pulling out his gun and standing up. Of course, let's go quickly. Yo, I replied and got out of the tent. Where to go? Joseph led me, and in 10 seconds we were standing at the right tent. We forgot the lantern, he whispered and then disappeared. I put my ear to the canvas, but there was silence inside. From far away from the company tent came bursts of laughter, singing, drumming and trumpet blast. And all this against a background of distant rumbling of guns. It was the Tobruk artillery sending its gifts to the Germans and Italians. A shadow flashed close by. There's the lantern, whispered Joseph. The entrance flap of the tent was tightly laced. But I cut the canvas with a knife and went inside. And you stand outside and guard. Just watch out, don't shoot. If anyone comes up, stun him, that's all, I told Joseph. The narrow beam of the lantern illuminated the tent. The cot was empty. Some boxes stood beside it. I found a steel box with a large padlock, slipped it under my arm, and hurried away. When we got back to our tent, we covered the box with a blanket. In it were the salaries of the whole company that served the headquarters. No. To think how simple it all turned out to be. Joseph could not contain his admiration. Now let's think how to get out of here. I said. Let's steal an armoured car, Joseph suggested. No, that would give us away quickly, and besides, a heavy vehicle would only be a hindrance if we were chased. We'll have to climb into the mountainous terrain, and the car won't pass there. Then let's take 2 BMW motorbikes with sidecars, said Joseph. They will go everywhere, and you can't see them from afar. That's a great idea. Pick a couple of better ones, fill them up with petrol, check the oil, and make sure they have tools in case they break down, I told him. I'll put them behind the tent, Joseph suggested. I nodded and he left. I quickly followed him out and jumped into my armoured vehicle. I took off my MG-334 machine gun and threw it on the ground. Opening the ammunition boxes, I pulled out the machine gun belts and threw them after the machine gun. 3,000 rounds of ammo would be enough for us. It was followed by the MP. 38 is modernized in the direction of simplification of manufacturing technology version MP40. Eddy, half a dozen magazines, 32 rounds each. Then a box with a dozen hand grenades and a large canister of water came out of the armoured vehicle. I had to find another full canister. Then I got the binoculars. As I climbed out of the vehicle, Joseph pulled up the first motorbike and put it behind the tent. Yes, I filled it up to the brim. It has new tyres and a toolkit, he reported and hurried off to get the second bike. 5 minutes later, almost all of our gear was stowed in the sidecar, and the machine gun was mounted on a hinged base. Joseph brought in the second motorbike. Is this motorbike all right? I asked. But then he put his hand over my mouth. Footsteps sounded on the sand. Hey, who's there? Came a voice and a figure emerged from the darkness. Why aren't you guys at the party? We have an urgent mission, I answered. But as the face of the man approached me, my insides snapped. It was a non-commissioned officer, the company treasurer. Ah, you're back? That's right. I didn't know you were back, said the purser. I relaxed and, almost out of breath, tried to think of something to stop him from entering my tent. Joseph slipped behind our tent and disappeared from sight. You're owed some money there, so come and see me in the morning and get it. Or who knows when you'll be able to collect it. He laughed, breathing a breath of beer booze on me. Did you bring the mail with you? And then I had a great idea. That's right, I replied. There's a letter for you. I noticed him as I was putting the mail into my sack. The treasurer had a cap on his head. He was a large and strong man, but, to his misfortune, he wore a light headdress. Hey, come into the tent, Mr. Non-Commissioned Officer, and I will give you your letter, I said, and flung open the entrance flap. Thank you, he muttered, bending down to enter. And at the same moment, the heavy grip of my parabellum came down on his head just above the temple. The cap flew off the treasurer's head. He fell face down on the sandy floor of the tent, and the entrance flap closed behind him. I instantly sat on top of him, but he was unconscious. Knocked out. Joseph was standing behind me. He was smiling, holding a spanner in his hand. I knew you'd stun him with something. You were quick with him, he said approvingly, and in less than half a minute had the treasurer's feet tied to his wrists with rope. I can't stand him. That swine has stiffed my money for some misdemeanor, Joseph muttered, pulling a clean handkerchief from his pocket and stuffing it deep into the treasurer's mouth. How pleasant it is, he said, to shut the bastard up. Now he can neither add nor take away anything. How glad I am, you bastard. We tied another cloth round the treasurer's neck and mouth so he couldn't spit it out. Emma, careful or he'll suffocate. Joseph, I said, and checked to see if the gag was too tight. It's just right. He'll be shot anyway, because he won't be able to explain where he put his wages. Joseph knew how to hate. We rolled the treasurer's body up against the wall and covered him with a broken cot, so he couldn't be seen. What should we do next? Joseph asked in a businesslike tone. We need maps, I said. Motef looked at me in surprise. Maps? How are we going to get them out of the bus? Bus he called a large command armoured personnel carrier, which we captured from the British and were everything necessary to lead an entire battle. After all, in it sleeps Captain Weiss and other members of the band that plays nearby, said Joseph. Hey, there is one way to do it, but it's very noisy, I said. Let's go. We left the tent. I took a machine gun from the sidecar of the motorbike, checked the magazine and handed it to Joseph. Then I took some more hand grenades out of the armoured vehicle, gave 2 to him, and stuck the others with the handles down behind the shins of my boots so that I could grab them quickly. Without maps we have nothing to do in the desert. We also need a compass and a sextant, I whispered. As we passed the tents, we saw the aforementioned armoured personnel carrier, which contained, among other things, a powerful radio station. You go to the beach, Joseph, and throw grenades there. Everyone will think that saboteurs have landed and will rush there. Joseph nodded and wanted to go, but I grabbed his arm. I could see that Joseph was delighted with my plan. He was gone in a second. I was soaking wet, but I pulled myself together, looked at my automatic and waited. From my point of view, this was the most crucial moment in our whole venture. If I could get maps, compass and sextant to plot a route through the desert, then all would be well. In civilian life, I was already a navigator. Without navigational aids, we couldn't cross the Sahara. We needed maps of Libya from the Mediterranean coast southwards, along the border with Egypt, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, and in the south and French possessions Equatorial and West Africa, down to Lake Chad and British Nigeria. Suddenly the silence of the night was broken by the rumble of an explosion. I fell flat on the ground next to the tent I was standing by. There was a second explosion, followed by a burst of gunfire. Joseph had done his job. What a commotion! People jumped out of some of the tents. The sound of the orchestra broke off in the middle of a musical phrase. Singing was replaced by shouts of alarm. Whistles were blowing, and firing began somewhere. Voices shouted commands. Soldiers on guard duty rushed to the beach. The lights came on, illuminating a section of it, but it was still hard to see. An anti-aircraft gun bellowed, throwing shells into the sea, a pair of searchlights switched on, and then a machine gun rumbled. The door of the command armoured personnel carrier swung open, and a figure in officer's trousers, but without boots, shirt or other details of clothing, sprang out. I recognized Captain Weiss. He held an MG.34 machine gun in his hand and stopped at the door. watching for a few moments the searchlight beams that moved from place to place, picking out tents and vehicles from the darkness, looking for the man who had caused the commotion. I raised myself on my hands, pulled a grenade from behind my shin and, pulling the pin, threw it as far away as I could. 3 seconds later, there was an explosion, and I saw its flash. The officer turned round in surprise and, pulling the bolt of the machine gun, quickly ran to the place where the grenade had exploded. In a second, I was already inside the armoured personnel carrier. I was often here, pinning flags on the map that marked the positions of the sides and their movement. A lamp under a green hood burned above the table. I pulled out a box of maps and looked through them quickly. In 30 seconds, I had selected the ones I needed. Then I took the wooden box with the sextant. A hand compass was lying nearby, so I grabbed that too. And then I came across something I had never expected to find, a messenger's staff flag. It was my luckiest find if you know how to use it. I hastily pulled another grenade from behind the shin of my boot. Not far away, a machine gun was firing, clucking like a hen that laid an egg, and I knew that Joseph was close by. I pulled the pin, walked over to the radio station and placed the grenade on it. With lightning speed, I jumped out of the truck, clutching my findings to my chest, and leapt behind a nearby tent. A figure came towards me, and I pointed my parabellum at it, but it was Joseph. "Let's get to the motorbikes," I whispered, ducking behind the tents. Shoving the maps and instruments into the sidecar, Joseph kicked the starter lever with his foot, and the motorbike started immediately. "What's the password today?" I asked, hitting the starter lever of my motorbike, but its engine wouldn't start. Soldiers ran past us onto the beach. Suddenly there was an explosion, and bright glints of light scattered everywhere. The grenade on the radio station had done its job. Panic gripped me. The engine won't start. Joseph jumped off his motorbike, leaned over and tapped on the carburetor of my car. At the same second the engine roared and we sped off, rounding the tent towards the checkpoint. Joseph, who was driving in front, hit the brake when he saw the red lights forbidding passage. I swore, but immediately realized he had done the right thing and braked next to his motorbike. Mother's password. There was a sharp shout and the muzzle of a rifle poked out of the darkness. "No, Cologne," answered Joseph. "Messengers to the 5th Light Division from August 1941, 2001st Tank. Ed in the Tank Regiment. I shall drive through," followed the order, and I thought that no one would have fulfilled it faster than us. Only then did I realize that the soldiers of the inner guard had fled to the beach, but the outer guard always stayed where they were, no matter what happened. We sped across the sand like devils, dodging thorny bushes. Our cars skidded, dust clouds kicked up all around us. I caught up with Joseph, and as we neared him I shouted, "We must take the Bardia Fort Capizzo road, and from there we will turn to Tariq El Abad." He nodded, and we sped off in the darkness towards the big tarred motorway. A few hours later, I awoke from a sound sleep, feeling someone shaking me violently. I saw Joseph leaning over. "This is not a morgue, Tunter. Wake up." "We have to go on," he said, and pulled off the tarpaulin I was sleeping under. The sun was burning the ground fiercely. I shook my head, making a cloud of dust rise above it. I felt tired. The 24 hours I'd spent driving the night before the escape had taken its toll. Joseph boiled water and made tea. As there was no firewood in the desert, we usually filled a tin can with sand and poured petrol into it. You could cook food on this improvised burner. It had only one drawback. It smoked terribly until it heated up properly. "It must be past noon by now," I said, standing up and shaking and folding the blanket. "It's like an oven in here," Joseph muttered, pointing with his eyes to the rocks surrounding the hollow where we were staying. "Well, the tea is ready." He handed me a tin of brown liquid. "Were you up there?" I asked. He nodded. "I could barely climb the damn rocks. They were so hot, I almost burnt my hands climbing up them. And if you lose your boots, it's the end," said Joseph. "Did you notice anything?" I asked. "No, just rippling waves of hot air and lizards and scorpions under every rock. Otherwise it's as empty as any self-respecting desert. I'll bet anything that a few kilometers from here some British scouting vehicle, an armoured car or a jeep, is sneaking around." Joseph looked at me doubtfully. "Do you think so?" We got up, collected the food and utensils, which consisted of a few tins of jam, and stuffed them into the sidecar of one of the motorbikes. 100% sure, I replied. Whenever I passed through here, I either came under fire or saw a cloud of dust kicked up by a speeding car. No. So this is where they tried to finish you off yesterday? Joseph asked. 15 kilometers from here. We passed this place at dawn. There was also a burnt-out bus somewhere close to the road, I said, and walked over to my motorbike. I understand that now all the two-legged men with guns will be after us, said Joseph. Germans, Italians, Australians, New Zealanders, Englishmen, and maybe even the stinking Arabs. I laughed. And there are no other fugitives here but you and me. We have a firm hold on the monopoly. We packed our things into the prams. We had miles of sand to travel before we were safe. It was time to get back out on that griddle. What do you think they'll do at the stakes when they find out we've escaped? Joseph asked. I hope they won't realize that we set off the fireworks last night. Don't be so naive, Joseph, I replied. As soon as they find the sergeant tied up in our tent, they will realize who did it and why. Joseph laughed. I hope that the guys, having not received their wages for this week, will not be too angry with us. It's a vile thing to take all their hard-earned money. I went to the pram and pulled out the cash box. It's not the money they'll be sorry for, I replied, setting it on the ground, but the fact that they won't have a single lira to wipe themselves with. Hey, I recognize you, Tunter. You're always laughing at everything, even toilet paper. Poor Joseph, he thought he'd said something funny. I tried to open the lid, which had 2 padlocks, but I couldn't. So I took the machine gun out of the pram and said to Josie, make sure you don't get hit by a ricochet. He bounced to the side. With a short burst, I knocked off both locks and lifted the lid. The box was full of neatly tied bundles of money. 5 minutes later, we found out that we had 62,000 liras for the two of us. We have nowhere to put it here, I remarked, as I threw the lid down with a clatter and threw the box into the pram. Yes, there's nowhere to put it, Joseph smiled, but let me get to the ladies in Benghazi. I'll have a lot of fun there, he said cheerfully. Of course, I agreed. Unless, of course, the military policemen or the Gestapo boys make fun of you before then. Bullets, you know, can take all the strength out of a man if they get in their way. You're an ulcer, Joseph grumbled. If you forget the danger for a moment, my friend, I told him, you will surely fall into the clutches of the military police. Nonsense, he shouted. It's a big desert. How will they know where to look for us? What are you going to drink? I asked him venomously. The same as you. Water, answered Joseph. Of course, there are plenty of rivers here. Remember, from here to Tripoli, there are only a dozen places where there is water, I said sarcastically. No one's going to bring it to us. We'll have to get it, and when we do, we'll be met with bullets. You'll see, there's a man at every crane, every cistern has a sentry, and every well, if there are any, is guarded as well as any bank. So every time we want a drink, we'll have to fight a battle, Joseph said thoughtfully. If we can get to coastal Cyrenaica, we won't have any problems with water and food, I said. It's only about 400 kilometers, but I'll eat my hat if the road isn't packed with patrols. And when we get past El Tazala, we'll be outside the front line zone, and there'll be military policemen like lice on our heads, I said, pulling a map out of my briefcase and studying it. It's about 100 kilometers to El Adama, another 50 to Akrama, 60 to the White House on Via Balbia, and about 200 to Derna, if you go along via Balbia. It's not far, said Joseph, but it reminds me of an obstacle course. I nodded. Once we get to El Adama, we'll have to keep our eyes open. I'm sure by now every soldier knows we're on the run. I think you're wrong, said Joseph. Our escape will be reported only to checkpoints, military police and the Gestapo, because if we go everywhere, there will be people who will want to follow our example, at least Italians. Maybe you're right, but we can't count on that, I said. Now let's go back up that cliff. Let's have another look at what's moving below. Not me. I strained all my ligaments trying to climb up there, Joseph groaned. All right, I'll do it, while you refuel the bikes. We can't leave without looking around. The dust we kick up could easily give us away, I said and climbed up the rock. I soon realized that Joseph was right. The sun was burning like fire and the rocks were as hot as red-hot metal. Whenever my foot fell off on a loose rock and I had to grab onto the rock, I burned my fingers. Scorpions and millipedes would pop out from under the rocks that rolled down. A sting from a local scorpion can be fatal, And if you don't die, you will lie in bed for weeks, screaming in pain from cramped legs and arms. Finally, I climbed to the top of the cliff and saw the crest of another rising above it, so I was almost invisible against the bright blue sky. I looked round and saw that waves of hot air were rising over the desert like a pudding. I was sweating profusely, but there were no spots or moisture on my skin. Everything evaporated instantly. In Tariq El Abd Road, visible in the distance, was a chaotic tangle of car-tired tracks and tank tracks. The surface of the Libyan desert, covered with barkhans that swept over the horizon like the waves of the sea, was completely empty. Nothing moved. There were not even clouds of dust. It was ideal terrain for aeroplanes. They could see everything on the ground, and whoever they caught among the sands had nowhere to hide. When I was a messenger and delivered dispatches, I often travelled alone, and many times I came under fire from hurricanes, which usually flew from the direction of the sun. It was quite impossible to spot them in time. Their approach was signalled by the roar of their engines and the hail of bullets from 87.7 mm machine guns, which raised clouds of dust above the ground. I wondered how I had managed to survive. I hadn't even been hit once. Looking at the glittering desert plain in front of me, I realized the main danger that awaited us, and it was not the chase that would follow us at our heels. Our greatest enemy was the desert. A stalled engine, a broken axle, or a hole in the petrol tank meant certain death. After another careful look around, I decided that no one would notice our departure. As I was going downstairs, Joseph shouted to me, "Well, how is it up there? Is anyone dusting?" "No one," I replied and jumped down to the ground. "Here, there's no petrol left. I've poured everything we had into the tanks, but there's plenty of water," he said, and kicked the engine of his motorbike. After looking around to make sure we hadn't forgotten anything, we got on our motorbikes and set off, winding through the rocks towards the valley exit,